Okay, then I would like to welcome you all to this Team Society webinar. My name is Sarah Heidenreich. I'm a researcher at the Department for Interdisciplinary Studies of Culture at NTNU, and I will guide you through this webinar. This is a second webinar of a new series of webinars organized by the Team Society. The Team Society is one of several so-called teams which are organized under NTNU Energy, which is one of NTNU's strategic research areas. And the Team Society can be thought of a platform who's aiming to strengthen and showcase energy-related social science and humanities research. Today's webinar will be about how cultural eyeglasses affect public opinion about energy. Our speaker is Stefan Geis, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Sociology and Political Science. And we also have a discussant, Hilde Björkhaug, who is Professor at the same department. Before giving the word to Stefan, I would like to remind you about that this webinar will be recorded and that you can ask questions either in the chat or directly later after the presentations by just raising your hand. Okay, with that, I would like to give the word to Stefan and stop sharing here.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. So I'm trying to share my screen now. So can you see it? The presentation? Yes. Okay. Thank you for coming in such large numbers to listen to this presentation. As Sarah already introduced, it's about between culture differences in public opinion about energy. Although empirically it's just cross-national, so we just compare countries and think that cultural eyeglasses, how we call it, are the most plausible explanation for the kinds of things we find, but that's up for discussion. So I'm the first author on this one, but there's two PhD candidates of mine, Christina Monse and Sigurd Lundheim, involved as well as project partners in Germany, France, and Poland to also have some insights from each national perspective, so to say. Okay. The research problem I'm departing from was the observation that sustainable energy systems, as we probably all believe, are key to solving many future problems societies face. But there's a lot of obstacles to overcome. So there are many projects that energy-related projects that face strong resistance at local levels, despite strong national level support in opinion polls. But that might be a bit of an artifact. So there might be some social desirability bias that people on a very general level say they agree to building more renewable energy capacities, for instance, but when facing a real decision at their local places where they are, there it's probably a different story, and they engage in different kinds of opinion formation. The one key problem seems to be that what we are dealing with long-term structural and relatively subtle problems that are hard to communicate, where there's little significant single events that you can unambiguously attribute to, for instance, climate change. And the other difficult thing about this topic is that there's an ambiguous relationship between the actions societies can take or individuals can take and who's benefiting from that. So there's always kind of free rider dilemma, like if we in our country use less coal or less gas for electricity production, for instance, it might be that just market prices go down and somebody else will use it and burn it. So one question is, why is communication not more effective in strengthening support for renewable energies? And I wanted to look at attitude structures in the different countries to come closer to answering this, this question. There's two major ways in which usually public opinion change is conceptualized, two routes along which public acceptance could change over time. One is to change the public acceptance of particular thoughts or considerations about the options. So for instance, you could persuade citizens that climate change can be mitigated, or you could persuade them that renewable energy need not necessarily be expensive. But this route usually faces strong social and cognitive resistance, so-called confirmation bias. The other way is to change the relative importance of considerations people already hold and make it more relevant for forming the attitude. So for instance, if people already think that renewable energy is key to climate change mitigation, you would just increase the salience of climate change, try to increase that, make it more prominent, and probably decrease the salience of electricity costs if people think renewable energy is more expensive. However, this may backfire when it's about more specific local projects, and it might cause, like if there's a lot of coverage in the media, for instance, about climate change, this has drawbacks as well. People get unnerved by the great prominence of the issue, for instance. So one question is, are there other points of entry than these two recipes for public opinion change? Look at relevant research and theory gave some hints, and I came up with two provocations I'd like to raise in this paper. And one is that there is no fast and quick solution to opinion change. Change takes time, so there's no way to really force short-term public opinion change, because that will only evoke ever stronger resistance. It takes time to adapt, and this adaptation comes with policy change. So it's not necessarily that opinion change comes before policy change, but policy change might come first. Elite discourse must change, and norms must change, and practices. This takes continuous effort, so it doesn't mean like we just lean back for 30 years and wait until it has changed. But we can't think of this as a short-term campaign. And the other thing is that we should probably need a stronger rationale for culture sensitivity. If we want to speed up opinion change, the cultural eyeglasses through which energy systems are viewed must be considered. So messages will be more effective if they are more flexible and can account for specific points of resistance at national level. This is what this study probably suggests, but by extension also on regional or local levels. For the slow evolution argument I was making, I want to point out how long it took to persuade the American public that smoking causes lung cancer. So in the graph you see below, we have public opinion measurements in the 1950s up until the year 2000, and until like a peak or a threshold of 90% was persuaded that smoking causes lung cancer. It took 30, maybe 40 years. So that's where like the science is relatively simple, and still there was this really slow change, particularly as long as there are no salient key events or turning points, which we have, however, seen in energy policy as well. So if we think of nuclear accidents at Chernobyl or Fukushima, these certainly have had a more discrete and immediate impact on public opinion, but this cannot be, this is not the case for renewable energies as an alternative. And the mechanism behind that is that the status quo in a society shapes policy, it shapes elite discourse, and it shapes practices at the individual level and norms. So only the status quo just changes gradually, and with it, the cultural underpinnings of public opinion. And that's one reason, or the major reason, for the sloth of this change. And if we look at the 4 countries that the study I will be presenting is covering, there's very different status quo in these 4 countries, and that's the reason why we sampled them. So if you look at Poland, it has an enormous share of fossil fuels in its electricity mix. In Norway, it's almost completely renewable. In France, it's mostly nuclear power, and in Germany, it's a mixture of the 3 components, with shrinking nuclear energy part. So that's how we think we might learn something about the influence of the status quo by having these 4 very different countries. And that gives us one of the hypotheses that the higher the current share of an energy source in a nation's electricity mix, the greater its public support. The other part of the argument is regarding these mechanisms of persuasion and priming. We don't study communication processes, but just the structures of attitudes. But we can still learn something about how communication might work or function in these instances. With a few grains of salt, we can extract some arguments in debates about energy systems that are resonant in public most of the time. First one is that electricity from renewable sources is usually more expensive than electricity from conventional sources. And that might not always be true, but that's a conviction many people hold, and that would give us the prediction that greater concern about electricity prices should be associated with a lower support for renewables. The second part is that renewable energy sources are less reliable in providing electricity. That's the base load argument, basically, might not always be true, but it's a common belief. So greater concern about electricity interruptions would reduce support for renewables, according to this. The third one is that renewable energy sources produce less greenhouse gas emissions per electricity unit supplied. So greater concern about about climate change, would strengthen support for renewables. And renewable energies would, as a fourth point, be a possible way to reduce dependency on foreign nations to generate electricity. And therefore, greater concern about energy dependence would strengthen support for renewables. And from the classical outlook, that's a simple equation. Public opinion will only change if we change the beliefs 1 or 2 that are negative for renewables, if we decrease the salience of these beliefs alternatively, or if we increase the salience of beliefs 3 and 4. However, and that's the title of this paper, there's so-called energy cultures that are likely to differ between the countries, probably in the direction of the status quo, where messages don't always hit the same backgrounds, but different backgrounds in the different countries, that would give different reactions to the same kinds of messages and arguments, and probably surprising reactions in some ways. And that's the major research questions for this paper. So do significant differences between countries remain after including those considerations about energy and climate change? Do significant differences between countries in acceptance of renewable energy remain after including considerations plus relevant societal values and demographics? So even if we use more predictors in our model. And the third question, do concerns about energy dependence, energy supply, energy costs, and climate change, so these were the four departments specified before, do they affect energy source preference differently in different countries? So do they have a different impact, the same arguments or considerations in different countries? The method is a secondary data analysis of the European Social Survey wave 8 from 2016-2017. That's because the questionnaire includes a special module on energy policy, energy security, and climate change that is a very good opportunity to test these assumptions. Data are from these 4 countries. ESS includes many more, but for this analysis, we kind of contrasted these most different cases. And the interviewing mode was personal interviews, personal standardized interviews. To give you an impression of what kinds of questions are included here is the dependent variable are energy source preferences. Question was how much of the electricity used in your country should be generated from each source, and people could choose between on a 5-point scale, none at all to a very large amount. So it's a bit unspecific, not percentages, but just large, very large. Therefore, because people could in principle say, I want a very large amount of everything, there's a second variable that is the propensity to pick larger amounts. So if somebody said, yeah, I want a lot of coal, a lot of gas, a lot of hydropower, a lot of nuclear power, that would be a high propensity to pick larger amounts, and that's a control variable. Then we have operationalizations of the considerations I've been talking about, worries about energy security, like power interruptions, energy trade dependence, energy costs, worries about climate change and perceptions of climate change debate. The status quo is the electricity mix data in the different countries, so that's not ESS based, and the use of information sources, which is not so detailed, so it's only about how much political news have people been using and how much have they been using the internet. So let's look at some of the results there. First, some descriptives. For the dependent variable, what energy mixes people in these 4 countries really prefer. And what we see is a general pattern that renewable energy sources get a much higher support than conventional energy sources. But there's also distinct differences between the countries. Like Norway, hydropower is very popular because it's also very widespread. In Norway and Germany, nuclear power is very unpopular. But it's also relatively unpopular in France, given that there's a lot of nuclear power in use there. And coal has a very high acceptance. So that might be some evidence for the status quo hypothesis, but we'll have a more explicit test of that later. Then regarding the energy security considerations, we see that on average, the extent of worry isn't very large. On average, it would be like somewhat worried about it being too expensive, being too dependent on imports, having too much fossil fuel firing, and very little concern about technical failures, blackout, disasters, and terrorist attacks. So that would in principle be a good position for climate change to play a large role. But what we see there is also, not a great amount of concern. So what we see is that most respondents kind of believe in climate change, and mostly that it's anthropogenic and that they have some degree of personal responsibility, but they have a very low belief in that something can be done about it, or that it's likely that they themselves, the people or their government will be effective in combating climate change. And the degree of worry is also not very large. It's on the same scale as the other kinds of worries. And if we put it into perspective, it's kind of about concern about costs or being too dependent on fossil fuels. So the degree of concern isn't really great as well. Now a little bit more into the hypotheses. Let's look at the country level variation that a model using these considerations, information sources, and so on can explain. So first of all, in the raw data, we see that there's a lot of unexplained variance at the country level, particularly regarding coal power, nuclear power, and some renewable energies, which are mostly explained by two factors. So the goal is to get a zero horizontal line here in all colors to explain the variance. So one thing is that particular energy sources are more popular than others. That's the difference between graph 0 and graph 1. The considerations don't really explain a lot at the country level. They explain a lot at the individual level, but the country level variation is not really affected. And the values and sociodemographics also have little impact. But what has an impact is the status quo in the respective countries, where we really closely approach this zero line, and only nuclear power is kind of still puzzling a little bit how much support it gets. So it gets more support than we would expect in Poland and less than we would expect in Germany and Norway. But that might be the special history of nuclear power. Okay. And the other set of country specificities was whether the strength and direction of considerations vary between countries. And what you should look out for is horizontal lines in the graphs that I'm plotting now. So for coal, we see some arguments are constant in their effect across countries. That would be the concern for power interruptions, for instance. That has more or less the same effect between countries. But the impact of the salience of climate change is very different. So this has a strong negative impact on coal support in Germany, France, and Poland, but has little effect in Norway, for instance. What we see is that we have quite a lot of country dependency in the value of these considerations. We also see some differences for gas, for instance, the attribution of climate change to human activity and the perception that it's bad. That has a lot of impact in Germany, smaller negative impact in France and Norway, and little effect in Poland, maybe even a positive one. Yeah, and that's more or less the same for most of the dependent variables. So we see a lot of variation in the coefficients, even reversing the direction. So some arguments or considerations have a positive effect in some countries and negative effect in other countries. Hydroelectric power, for instance, is like has no cost component in most countries except for Norway, where it has a negative impact. So people who are more concerned about energy costs are less supportive of hydropower, maybe because they think other sources of electricity could reduce the prices. Yes, so we basically see that for all energy sources. In principle, the hypotheses 1 to 4 were correct in that if you look at all countries at the same time, or the average across countries, like costs are more of a problem for renewable energy sources, whereas climate change tends to help renewable energy sources in the electricity mix preferences, but it's not always the same in every country. Can even be reversed. Yes. I could also talk about the specific effect of information source use, but I'll skip that in facing progress of time. So let's go straight for the discussion. The implications I see, or the takeaways I see in this study, is that it demonstrates that the status quo in energy mix has a strong impact on the country level averages of energy source preferences, and individual level variables do not account for that. So that's something that goes beyond what individuals perceive as pros and cons of the different energy sources. And the pathway this suggests is that if changes in energy mix are implemented by step, acceptance may actually rise in the long run. The second point is that arguments and associated considerations largely have the growth effects we expect them to have, but that's only one part of the story. So for instance, renewable energy acceptance benefits from concerns about climate change and energy independence, but these considerations have differential impact in the different countries. So it might be that this is effective in 2 or 3 countries, but not in all 4 countries and not in every country. So what we seem to need is a more tailored communication based on insight about the cultural belief systems and practices in the respective countries. Regarding the limitations of this study and potential for further study, there seems to be a relationship between objective givens and cultural belief systems that's hard to disentangle. For instance, that in Norway there's more support for hydropower, of course also traces back to the availability of hydropower in Norway and the establishment of hydropower. But to what extent is this an objective given, and to what extent is it culturally constructed? That's hard to say at the moment. Also, the data are a bit limited in their concentration on electricity production, which is kind of a misfit for Norway because the electricity production is so much based on hydroelectric power that there's not really a choice involved there. And what the study also doesn't have is good measures of information use, and we cannot directly test communication effects, and we don't have any knowledge of communication patterns and need accompanying survey experiments or content analysis data to make better claims there. Then there's no longitudinal data involved. There's no longitudinal data of similar quality or resolution. That's a desideratum. And there's no measurement of energy practices and material culture involved, which is a limitation. And we cannot see anything about regional and local levels from these data. So project case studies are an important complement to this. Yes, so that concludes my presentation. And yeah, if you have any questions, ask them now or come back to me via email or on the phone or wherever you prefer.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan, for this really, really interesting presentation. I would now first like to give the word to Hilde for some comments, questions to Stefan before opening the floor to the audience. Yeah, you.
Yeah.
Oh.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Stefan, for a good presentation, which was, for me, also accompanied with a paper that I've been able to read beforehand. I am myself a sociologist in, among others, agriculture and food studies, and recently led the participatory foresight process on transitioning to a bioeconomy, starting out with more resource-based bioeconomy kind of way into it, with a focus on increased use of forest grown plants, seaweed, etc., growing algae, but then working ourselves into the area of the need of greater societal transitions, like changing citizen behavior, attitudes, practices. So that's kind of sort of my background, but this paper isn't that much related maybe to the bioresources, bioenergy transition, as the focus is more, or the findings are more connected to other main energy sources, maybe into the household, and what we do need on our daily basis. But this paper is, of course, extremely relevant to help understand public opinion about energy. In Norway, we now see a growing polarization or resistance towards, for instance, building windmills on land in coastal mountain areas in particular. But we also have, like, it's not seldom to wake up with the news on technology failure. This morning we read about, I don't know, 60,000 households in southern Norway having no electricity, and how it affects, of course, households and transport and commuting. So it's relevant, and this is kind of everyday. This is everyday of everyday relevance. I wonder if you used the example introductorily on smoking, showing how scientists spend a lot of time to change opinion on smoking behavior. Smoking causes health issues. I wonder if one of the challenges when it comes to renewables, not on renewables versus non-renewable energies, might be the not uniform or decision on what is best energy or most sustainable energy sources. Like in Norway, the effect of upgrading versus building new, and other, of course, other issues in different countries. I don't know if you want to comment on that now, or the comparison on the cases.
Yeah, I can. So what I think matters most here is the structure of elite discourse that you see as a citizen in the mass media, which kind of played a big role in the smoking debate as well, because their big industry was, of course, behind slowing down any diffusion or uncontested diffusion of the argument. And I think much of the same is going on in the in the energy business. I'm a bit more familiar with the German case, but where you of course have these strong traditional electricity providers with coal-based power plants and gas-based power plants and nuclear power plants, and they of course try their best to come up with any kinds of arguments that maybe not refute the need to go for more renewable energy, but like to not let the cost explode, we need to go slow, and we need to do this first and that first. And I think very much the same was with the smoking industry, which had their scientists and their data that kind of showed, yeah, it's kind of ambiguous, you don't have strong causal evidence, it's all just correlational. And then people kind of want to doubt a little bit, maybe because it's more convenient to keep things as they are and go on smoking and not quit or be under pressure to quit. Then it's easy to kind of settle for, okay, so scientists are divided, so I don't have to take a stance now. And I think very much the same is with electricity as well. So we all have our habits of having our gas-fueled cars, and we bought them maybe only 5 years ago, and we can't scrap them now for an electricity-based car. We bought a house somewhere in the green and can't get to the city center. So it's more convenient to just say, yeah, no, let's see how it evolves first.
Yeah, I think you explained that well. Maybe elaborate deeper into that issue actually in you continuing writing on this, because your findings are quite clear, as I guess you summed up. People want renewables, but at the same time we're not that worried, and we're happy about status quo. It's more convenient, and at least it's more convenient if changing has a cost, either social, environmental, or economic, to us. So, yeah, going back to this country, when comparing countries, which I think is interesting and important to kind of distinguish between and within, or looking for specificities within. But how much contextual or case-specific info is actually needed to do a proper comparative analysis? So you looked at energy systems, you're able to kind of comment on some maybe cultural aspect, but yeah, it's more what is needed. Yeah.
Yeah, I probably need to elaborate a little bit more on the country selection, which is kind of part of a longer perspective in this, because it's more or less just a starting point for a series of projects I'm imagining, and where this contrast between relatively different energy systems is of great importance. So that's one thing behind this this selection, because in principle, regarding the data that are used and that are being collected, we could also have used basically all of the ESS countries and used the natural variation that's in there. But the reason we didn't was that it would allow us for a better ex post contextualization of the results. So we found it hard to make country-specific predictions a priori, or very burdensome to elaborate in the theory section why in Poland this argument should be stronger than in Norway and so on. But it allows us to kind of go more deeply into, yeah, we see a difference in the impact that this argument has, or this consideration has in this country, and what might it mean. And we felt that's easier to do if you have a limited set of countries.
I think I'll ask two more questions. I'm sure there are a range of other questions also. The two questions, one connected to culture and second one to methodologies. First one then, yeah, how can one pick up on the cultural eyeglasses or cultural perceptions there, and what actually are you measuring in when it comes to culture? Is it energy culture? Is it well, maybe I wonder if there are, in addition, environmental cultures that you could also pick up on in the data, that I'd be interested to see what is national, what is personal. And also when it comes to this perception connected to cultures, this distinguishing between individual, state, collective responsibility when it comes to change, because of course who are responsible, and who are we responsible for? Are we responsible for our state or community or the global future? Yeah. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on the connection between this cultural maybe country and
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's definitely a tricky thing, because when we started with it, our idea was we look at these expressions of considerations regarding energy security and climate change as like the tip of an iceberg of the energy cultures below it. So that was what we started out with. But what we've seen and what I demonstrated with the data is that if you really look at it, the considerations don't explain anything at the country level. So basically, the higher averages in specific countries compared to others, that doesn't trace back to the variation in this variable. Maybe a way forward would be to use deviations from specific average at the individual level to account for something. But basically, I think this seems to be much more deep-rooted than I first imagined, and the only like empirical connector remains the status quo measure. So I was really surprised about that, and even adding a lot of the value measurements included in ESS, which I also thought might capture something of the cultural differences, wasn't really successful. It also doesn't improve the country level explanation a lot. So that was surprising, and it doesn't seem like these patterns we are really interested in make their way into the question, into the responses to questionnaire items. So yeah, that's more tricky than we thought, and like it remains puzzling how to capture that empirically.
Right. Okay, thank you. A final just comment, or maybe a question on how you evaluate the robustness of your model and the data you have available. Now you explain, maybe you have looked at different aspects maybe of the survey as well without including it, or is that?
I didn't fully understand. So what
okay.
from the survey we included?
Did you test for other variables? Is that what you said? Yeah.
Yeah, so the classical socio-demographics, for instance, are of course included. Lots of value orientations we've tested, like also environmental beliefs, which are included there. It's not in a great resolution, but there's some items capturing that, and still that doesn't seem to be the main difference between the countries. It's more like individual level variation that accounts for some other individual level variation, but little of this was initially like mapped at the country level.
No, thanks. I think I'll leave the floor open for others and say thank you very much. And I'm really looking forward to see how this project evolves, and also this dimension maybe on if I understand correctly, the news, looking deeper into media and news and how it, So it's going to be interesting to follow your work and your colleagues' work. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Hilde.
Okay, thank you, Hilde, for some really good questions and interesting discussions. Now I open the floor to the audience. Christian Klöckner, you're raising your hand.
So now I have
unmuted yourself. Great.
Unmute button, yes. Yeah, I do have one more content-related question and maybe a little bit more nasty method question afterwards. But first of all, thank you for an interesting presentation, Stefan. And I like the focus on like what you call like the energy cultural impact on people's relation to different energy production methods. I would be a bit careful, however, if I would really call your effects of the energy culture, or if it's more sometimes effects of the energy system in a certain country. And then again, there might be a discussion if that isn't culture. But that aside, I give you an example. When you showed that people from Poland were, if they were more convinced of climate change, I think they were more positive to gas as opposed to all the other countries where it was a negative effect, which makes total sense if you have an energy system as Poland, because like increasing the gas fraction in Poland would be a big improvement as compared to how it is now. That is not necessarily an indication of culture, but it could rather be that the status the energy system has in Poland makes gas a viable alternative, whereas having more gas in Norway would not be a good idea.
That's a very good point, because it accounts for a lot of the specificities we see, particularly in Norway, where you kind of have to reappraise a lot of these differences, because the electricity system is already almost completely based on renewable energies. So
yes. So I would say that in your comparison, both Norway and Poland are outliers in their extremes. So they're like the status of the energy system might explain some of the results.
Yeah, you're totally right, and that's what I meant in the discussion with the difficulty to distinguish between the objective givens and how they are culturally constructed or socially constructed, and that's more or less impossible to disentangle. But like if you go to the specific coefficients, you can maybe come up with a relatively rational explanation for it, or not. So maybe that's the way forward in that department.
So then the other question is, you say that your status quo variable is by far the strongest predictor, but that is a country level variable. And on the country level, you only have 4 units, and they also have been selected to be different. So how can you trust that this variable, and first of all, how did you include it in your regression analysis? Was this a multi-level analysis where you said that, yeah, okay, good. But then how can you run a reliable multi-level analysis with only 4 level 2 units, and especially with those extreme level 2 units?
You're right. So this is only on the country level, and most other variables are at the individual level in this multi-level model. But the interesting thing here is that you have almost the complete scope of variation for all the energy sources captured in the 4 countries. You're also right in that more level 2 units would be desirable, of course, but we kind of see a predictable direction of the respective status quo impacts. Let me make an example. So what I included is for each source of electricity, the percentage in the country's electricity mix. So it doesn't specify this is coal or this is gas. It's just the percentage of the respective technology in the current electricity mix. So that can only have an effect in one direction. It doesn't estimate an effect for nuclear power itself, or an effect for gas based electricity itself. So there's only one coefficient in which it can can impact. So it always has the positive impact. So the impact is always in the same direction in all 7 models for 7 sorts of electricity, and that's what gives me some confidence that because it could be in the other direction as well. So I'm pretty confident that this is a systematic effect. But certainly that would be an important point for including all 20 countries that the survey includes in the next step. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christian. We have 2 more questions maybe before we wrap up. Thomas and Marianne, maybe Thomas first.
Okay, yeah, great. Thanks a lot. Really interesting presentation. So I have, I guess, a kind of a 2-step comment / question. This is really a question, so it's not one of those. So you start off by the energy cultures framework in a sense, and I must say that I'm not at all surprised that you then end up sort of confirming this status quo hypothesis, because on one hand it is a very interesting framework, but on the other hand it's also one of those frameworks that is really good at explaining why things are the way they are. So I wanted to kind of ask about the relationship between this setup, your results, and the potential for change, because you, in the beginning here, you had some ideas. You said, for instance, that one opportunity was to then simply implement the new technologies, and then acceptance would follow, in a sense. And I guess if you tie that into the comment that Hilde made about the relationship to smoking, I guess the relationship between different renewable energy technologies and sort of the good choice for society here is less clear than, you know, cutting smoking will get you in a better shape. But here there's a whole sort of menu of renewables that you can choose from that I guess are quite different in different contexts. So that is one sort of aspect of this comment. And the other aspect of this comment / question would be if you sort of broaden the view and look at all these countries where, for instance, solar uptake suddenly have been massive, sort of compared to the status quo. How could you begin to explain these changes? In a sense, are we then back to the economists and saying that this is only about price, or do we have tools in this toolkit to also begin to capture those changes that are in a sense happening?
So regarding the first comment, pathways to change and their potentials, I would agree that sustainable energy systems, it's even a more complicated topic to communicate than smoking, because I think one of the greatest obstacles to overcome is the coping aspect. So the idea that everything we do in Norway, for instance, will only have detrimental effects in other countries, and it's all for nothing. Or it might be all for nothing, and we don't really know. And this ambiguity, makes it hard to mobilize a lot of support. But what we see in this survey and in other surveys is that there's a lot of at least weak and tacit support. And I think that's the window of opportunity for this slow incremental change. again, as one where Germany is probably one example, like the uptake of wind energy in Germany, it's been going on since the 1990s, and it's still in progress. There's phases of acceleration and deceleration, and it responds to like public opinion to some extent, but it seems like it has fostered the broad acceptance to some extent over time. I think if you would have had a big program building lots of windmills in Germany in 2000, that would have faced much more opposition than the slow but incremental change we've seen there. And it's not like there's no opposition against it, but there's not been an opportunity to materialize as much as it probably has been in Norway last year, or still this year. So yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, good. Let's hear Marianne.
Okay, Marianne, last question.
Yes, I think my first, I also had 2 questions, which seems to be very popular. Well, the first question is related to what Thomas asked, I think, because I'm curious about what you are really measuring with what I read as your dependent variable. If I got it right, it's about how much electricity should be generated from different energy sources. And I was also curious how this question relates to change and the potential for transitions. But also it seems to be some kind of idealized normative part of that question. So my first question was, what do you think this question really captures related to that? And my next question related to the energy system and how you set the boundaries when you talk about status quo. As for instance, I guess for Norway, for instance, the electric energy production side of it, the oil and gas industry is of course also a big part of the energy system and part of the culture. And so how do you consider these kinds of the sides of the energy system that is not related to the production of each country as part of the system?
Yeah, I'm in the comfortable position that I didn't develop those questions, so I can rant against them as well. And it's of course a compromise question in such a large scale survey where they apply with their set of questions and probably get selected by the committee running the study. So I'm also not completely happy with this question. For instance, it doesn't specify a time frame. One might think of next year or right now. It should by magic change right away. There's no time frame involved. There's no so there's very little specific information in the question that would guideline the respondent to some extent to all judge kind of the same kind of question. Most respondents will come up with different versions of how they understand the question, and that's always a bit problematic. So I'm not so happy with that one either. Particularly, I tried to mention that in the presentation, that it's not good for Norway at all because we'll have a ceiling problem as electricity is at 97% or whatever, hydropower, and other aspects of the energy system like transportation or industry, it's just not represented there and it's not asked for. yeah, so that's highly problematic, and I'm aware of that in the interpretations, but like there's no way to account for that empirically, because there's also not much in terms of other questions that would help you specify what people meant or get better response. A particular problem is, but that's not a fault of the questionnaire, that's just yeah, natural, is the social desirability bias you're facing there, because everybody knows or has learned that kind of renewables are good and nice, and it's not a big deal for in this kind of questions to tick, yeah, I want a lot of solar power, yes, I want a lot of wind power. That's a very easy response. You don't have any costs associated with that. So yeah, I would have hoped for a study highlighting a little bit, or a question that would highlight that there are also disadvantages and transition costs and stuff like this. But that's not in the question. So it's not surprising that the level of support seems to be very high, but I assume that a lot of that is, it will burst into bubbles if you hold a pin close to it. So it's probably not very elaborate attitude that we're capturing there.
Okay, thank you very much. Time is up. I see there's an interesting discussion started in the chat, so there's definitely more to discuss here. But I think we have to close for today. I would like to thank again the speakers, Stefan and Hilde, the discussant, and all of you for joining. And I would like to remind you about our next webinar about empowering citizens and neighborhoods by co-creating extended realities for low-cost, energy-efficient answers to energy poverty. So I hope to see you all again in 2 weeks. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.